What led you to believe, except that he, that is Jesus, foretold that after death he would rise again? How many others produce wonders like this to convince simple hearers? They say that Orpheus did this among the Odrysians, in Protesilas, and Thessaly, and Heracles at Taenarus, and Theseus. Or do you think that the stories of these others really are myths, which they appear to be, and yet that the ending of your tragedy is to be regarded as noble and convincing? His cry from the cross when he expired, the earthquake and the darkness? While he was alive, he did not help himself, but after death he rose again and showed the marks of his punishment and how his hands had been pierced. But who saw this? A hysterical female, as you say? And perhaps some other one of those who were deluded by the same sorcery, who either dreamed in a certain state of mind and through wishful thinking had a hallucination due to some mistaken notion, an experience which has happened to thousands. He is one of our first witnesses to a reader, a critical, truly critical reader of the Gospels, who did not take them as history, but as fantastical tales, as he calls myths. He knows the Logos theology, and he's very familiar with the distinctive story of Matthew's dream visions by angels and the genealogy and Herod and the children. That's all distinctly Matthean material. For Celsus, he believed that there was an ancient doctrine known by all ancient peoples, including the Egyptians and the Jews, but that this doctrine, what he calls the Alēthēs Logos, the true doctrine, was perfected and refined by the Greeks. And Christianity, because it's a break-off movement from Judaism, represents a degradation of the ancient doctrine.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And I'm with my favorite scholar, M.Div Litwa, Ph.D. at University of Virginia, and then Master of Divinity at Emory University. You have wrote numerous books on these subjects. The most recent is Found Christianities, which is a must read. And if you want, you can get a discount on the book if you join the Patreon. Now, this Patreon has locked videos that you cannot get on YouTube that are only exclusive right here on M.Div Litwa's Patreon. It is the most valuable resource for digging into the ancient Christianity origins, non-commodity text, Gnostic stuff. It's the one-stop shop for all of that. And welcome M.Div Litwa to Gnostic Informant.
Great, glad to be here, Neil. It's good to be back, and hello, everyone. Today we'll be looking at hopefully a figure that is of interest to many of you, and that is the figure of Celsus. And Celsus is important because he is the earliest full-scale critic of Christianity. And I have a basic thesis about Celsus. I think that every argument that has been made against Christianity in all of time since Christianity appeared on the scene is foreshadowed by something which Celsus said. And there's many things that Celsus said that, in fact, he says better than modern critics of Christianity.
Wow.
So in a sense, yeah, he's the Christopher Hitchens of antiquity, or he has been called the Voltaire of antiquity. And it's a wild ride. Now, your access point to get to Celsus, though, is through Origen. And Origen writes a full-scale 8-book critique of Celsus called Against Celsus, okay? And, or you'll see it sometimes in the Latin as Contra Celsum. And in that work, Celsus is preserved verbatim, probably about 70 to 80%, because Origen just goes through line by line and tells you, here's what Celsus says, and here's my refutation. And one of the glorious things about reading this is you don't have to read all of Origen. It's a pretty thick book. You can just pick out more or less what Celsus says. But one of the fun things about reading it with Origen is, even today, one can see that sometimes Celsus even sounds better than Origen's refutation. So, Origen is still struggling to defeat Celsus, even though by the time that Origen is writing, Celsus has been dead probably for 70 years, or maybe a little bit less. But so Celsus writes we'll get to the date in a second, but Celsus writes probably in the 160s or 170s. In Origen writes his refutation around 248. So it's quite a difference in time. But let me go to the PowerPoint here, and I like to introduce. This is going to be a long quotation, so forgive me for that. But just to give you a taste of Celsus and his intellectual firepower. So he begins, or in one passage, addressing the Christians, what led you to believe, except that he, that is Jesus, foretold that after death he would rise again? How many others produce wonders like this to convince simple hearers? They say that Orpheus did this among the Odrysians, in Protesilas, and Thessaly, and Heracles at Tanarum, and Theseus. Or do you think that the stories of these others really are myths, which they appear to be, and yet that the ending of your tragedy is to be regarded as noble and convincing? His cry from the cross when he expired, the earthquake and the darkness? While he was alive, he did not help himself, but after death he rose again and showed the marks of his punishment and how his hands had been pierced. But who saw this? A hysterical female, as you say? And perhaps some other one of those who were deluded by the same sorcery, who either dreamed in a certain state of mind and through wishful thinking had a hallucination due to some mistaken notion, an experience which has happened to thousands, or who wanted to impress others by telling this fantastic tale, unquote. So you can really see here that Celsus, who's writing so early in the history of Christianity, is foreshadowing so many of the arguments against Christianity that appear and reappear throughout the centuries, and that were refined in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and now in the 21st century. He's already appealing to psychological hallucination. He's using his comparative tactics to talk about other Greco-Roman deities and heroes. And Celsus, who is a Greco-Roman himself, is very familiar, in fact, probably more familiar with figures like Orpheus, Heracles, and Theseus than he is with Jesus. And he is one of our first witnesses to a reader, a critical, truly critical reader of the Gospels, who did not take them as history, but as fantastical tales, as he calls myths. And so, it's really amazing to hear someone so early foreshadow so much. But let's look at some of the basic info that we can for Celsus. Although Origen thought wrongly that Celsus was an Epicurean, it is beyond doubt that Celsus was a Platonist, and a fairly sophisticated Platonist who lived from the mid to late 2nd century. He probably lived in Egypt, likely Alexandria, and I'll get to the arguments for that in a moment. And he probably had direct experience of areas like Palestine and Phoenicia, which by boat were only a week away. How do we know where Celsus might come from? Well, there have been several hypotheses. Some have wanted to put him in Rome, but for me, the regular demonstration of distinctly Egyptian knowledge shows, I think, that Celsus is writing from Egypt, or at least spent a very long time there. If we look at some of the data, and I'll just throw up 3 indications here, there are more. He notes in Book 168 that Egyptians, as he says, quote, for a few obols, that is basically short change, they make known their venerable lessons in the midst of marketplaces and drive out demones, or out of people, and blow away diseases and invoke the souls of heroes, displaying expensive banquets, tables, cakes, and condiments, which are non-existent, and who make non-living things move as if they were animals, unquote. Now, this is a very extraordinary testimony, by the way, as an aside here, of what Greco-Roman religion looked like on the ground. It wasn't this, pristine palace of thought, this cloud nine contemplation stuff. Greco-Roman religion, practiced by ordinary agents, was full of things that Christians have called, Christians and non-Christians have called magic, and that involve things like making people see things that aren't really there, healing diseases, and invoking dead people or heroes, and producing small miracles, like having other objects move on command, like a table or something like that. Those kinds of everyday experiences of religion were going on in the marketplaces. And Celsus, the only way he can have access to this stuff is if he's walking through the marketplaces, which, of course, he did. Celsus also notes, and this is also a quote, that Egyptians have glorious precincts and groves, many of which survive today, majestic and beautiful entrance ways, astounding temples, splendid awnings all around, with rites that are solemn and secretive. But when one enters and goes inside one of these temples, one sees them bowing down to cats, monkeys, crocodiles, goats, and dogs, unquote. Now, this is another really amazing testimony of Celsus and what his notion of Egyptian religion is and what he thinks is going on. He's obviously not an insider, and in some respects, he's quite narrow-minded. But what he gives witness to is Egyptian religion when it was alive and well. And it was definitely alive and well in the 2nd century. And unlike other critics who also make fun of the Egyptians for worshiping animals, Celsus gives us something different, this wonderful description of actual living temples with things like awnings and decorated gateways and trees and things that just aren't there anymore. Right now, if you go to Egypt and see the temples, they are just stone husks of what they were, fragments of what they were. But Celsus saw them in all their glory, and he gives this very nice indication. And then finally, something very distinctive to Egypt. Celsus knew the 36, what he calls demones, but are actually decans. And decans there's 36 of these. They're distinctive to Egypt, and they're in control over, each of them is in control of 10 degrees of the zodiacal circle. And they were thought to have control over the human body. And Celsus is even privy to some of their distinctively Egyptian names. So This is the kind of knowledge that one doesn't get through mere book learning. This is the kind of knowledge that one would get by actually living in Egypt, interacting with religious officials and priests in temples in Egypt, as well as some of these marketplace religious entrepreneurs who are trying to sell religion as they understood it. So that's the argument for his Egyptian provenance. If we take a look at the date, there's a couple of things which Celsus mentions that he's aware of. First of all, he's aware of Antinous' deification by Hadrian, and we can date that pretty precisely to 130. Antinous was Hadrian's young boyfriend, and Antinous accidentally drowned in the Nile River with Hadrian looking on. And Hadrian was absolutely mortified. Celsus is also aware that the Jews had been banished from their homeland, so he must be writing after 135, when that occurred after the Bar Kokhba revolt. He's also aware of Epictetus, and Epictetus, if you don't know him, is this really punchy, fun, Stoic philosopher who lived as far up until about probably the late 130s. But Arian, who died around 160, is the one who wrote up the lectures of Epictetus. And so if you get a copy of the Discourses of Epictetus, these are written by Arian, and Arian died later. So probably Celsus is aware of something that's written in the 140s or 150s. And then he says that he also wrote during a time when multiple emperors reigned. And that gives us two options. Either Marcus Aurelius is reigning with his younger co-emperor between 161 and 169, or Marcus is reigning with his son called Commodus, and that would be between 177 and 180. And most scholars choose the latter date. So most scholars you'll see have Celsus writing between 177 and 180. And that's a very precise date. And possibly that is the correct date. But yeah, I don't think we can exclude the slightly 160s date as well. If we look at the thesis, and it's quite a long treatment, if you've read it, I won't say it's as long as, some of the modern anti-Christian tractates, like from Richard Dawkins or something like that, but it's pretty long. And if you look at Celsus's thesis, in a sense, it's both similar and different to what we find in modern anti-Christian literature. For Celsus, he believed that there was an ancient doctrine known by all ancient peoples, including the Egyptians and the Jews, but that this doctrine, what he calls the Alēthēs logos, the true doctrine, was perfected and refined by the Greeks. And Christianity, because it's a break-off movement from Judaism, represents a degradation of the ancient doctrine, which is not only foolish, but also impious, because you're not supposed to break away from your fathers and ancestors. And that is one of the reasons, if not the chief reason, why Celsus thought that Christianity must be wrong, because it's a movement of rebels against their own intellectual tradition, that is, for them, which would be Judaism. For Celsus, Judaism is already a kind of degradation from Egyptian religion, because he believes that the original Jews were Egyptians, that they were kicked out of Egypt, and then Christianity is a further degradation of Judaism. So he believes in the past our ancestors had the truth, but since then it has been slowly degraded, and Christianity represents that degradation in a unfortunately virulent form, like a virus, which poisons the mind of the entire empire and throws the entire empire into confusion, because the more that Christianity spreads, the less worship is given to the traditional gods, who then respond with wrath, or by simply not protecting the Roman Empire, which was, as we know, finally destroyed in the West in the late, the 5th century. In terms of the outline of Celsus's work, which he calls the True Doctrine, if we look at books 1 and 2, it should be interesting to many because it's primarily a Jewish critique of the life of Jesus as presented in the Gospels. In book 3, Celsus says that only stupid people are Christians. In book 4, he has a full-on critique of the Incarnation, the book of Genesis, the final judgment, Christian exceptionalism, and anthropocentrism. In book 5, he turns to critique physicalist understandings of the resurrection and to point out Christian diversity, which is interesting. In book 6, he begins critiquing special revelation, Christian demonology, creation, and the physics of incarnation, which he thinks is impossible. And in book 7, he starts criticizing Christian prophecy, eschatology, or the doctrine of the last things, and then back to demonology. And then in book 8, he launches his own argument for polytheism and critique of Christian iconoclasm and martyrdom. So it's very important to understand that Celsus isn't an atheist and would never describe himself as an atheist. He is a very pious polytheist. But as a Platonist, he thinks that all the divine powers do ultimately go back to one single and centralized power. And but that doesn't mean that that there aren't multiple gods and daimones. Of course, there are multiple gods and daimones, and truly pious people worship the true God by worshiping the powers underneath the primal God. That's his basic position. One of the special, and we're finishing up here, but one of the special issues which I should mention also is that in those initial books, books 1 and 2, Celsus introduces a figure which has been called Celsus's Jew. That is, not only does he introduce Jewish arguments, he introduces a Jew as making those arguments and actually in dialogue with Jesus himself, showing how Jesus himself is wrong, which is pretty amazing stuff. And it's this Jew that is the very first witness who presents Jesus as born of Pantera. Okay, so Celsus is our first gateway into this tradition of Jesus's actual father being Pantera. Celsus is also the first witness that Jesus learned magic in Egypt and that he came back to Palestine in order to present himself as a god. And throughout this text, it's very clear that Celsus is familiar with the Gospels of Matthew and John. He knows the Logos theology, and he's very familiar with the distinctive story of Matthew's dream visions by angels and the genealogy and Herod and the children. That's all distinctly Matthean material. And he's also aware that by his time, which is mid to late 2nd century, Christians were now convincing multitudes, which means that it's the first time that really a Greco-Roman person begins to feel threatened. Because if you go back to Tacitus or Suetonius, they are aware of Christianity, but they barely mention it, and they're not at all threatened by it. In their early 2nd century, very much the same with Pliny the Younger, who wants to learn more about Christianity in Bithynia, that is in northern Turkey, about the year 110. And he's also not very threatened by it, and there's really nothing to learn at that point. But by the mid to late 2nd century, Christians were beginning to make more recruits, and therefore you had the full-scale attack. I'll just close with a meditation on the task of comparison. And Celsus, he's not trying to give Christianity the benefit of the doubt. He's absolutely a critic, but he is trying to do at least in principle, what might be considered a fair-minded kind of comparison. And this is very important when you, if you're really trying to, understand Christianity, and you can't defeat your opponent if you're not fair. And one of the things that Celsus says late in the work is, quote, "Where matters are equal, it's best to compare fairly on the same level," unquote. And it's only those comparisons which don't stack the deck that one can really create knowledge and light, actual light and not just smoke. But one of the things Celsus is, as I said, sometimes just fairly narrow-minded. But one of the things he says, it shows you how a Greco-Roman thinker would have thought at this time. He says, quote, "It makes no difference whether we call Zeus the Most High, or Zane, or Adonai, or Sabaoth, or Amun like the Egyptians, or Papias like the Scythians." And Celsus was perfectly happy to include Yahweh here as one of the names for the chief deity. But he noticed that when he raised these kinds of arguments, the Christians weren't willing to accept them. And as he notes in passing, and this remains true still today, okay, among when you argue with fundamentalists, Celsus observed, quote, "If you compare him," meaning Jesus, "with Apollo or Zeus, they, Christians, will not tolerate it." And that's why I say there's really nothing new under the sun here. I'll just close with some further reading. So the full translation of the Contra Celsum is by Henry Chadwick. Okay, this was done in the 50s. If you want just Celsus's true doctrine, you can look at the reconstruction of R. Joseph Hoffman. This reconstruction has been criticized because Hoffman needs to fill in the gaps, but it's a sort of, you can start there as a place to leap onto the larger work if you want. And then in my book, Jesus Deus, I've got a couple of chapters illuminating Celsus's project, mainly chapters 3 and 5. But there's much more, and if you join the Patreon, I can lead you to much more sources and answer all the questions that you have. So yeah, come join the community. That's it for the PowerPoint.
That was excellent. I have a question off the last thing you said. Why don't you do? Have you ever thought about you filling in the gaps of the stuff that we lost? Because I can't think of a better person who would probably have a better idea of what would be the lost, missing information from the Contra Celsus to the stuff that's lost. Have you ever thought about trying to be the one to do that?
Well, we can't reconstruct what is actually lost, because what's lost is lost, and it's not like a fragmentary text. Okay. Where you can like piece together and guess what the missing word is or the missing letters. It's simply what Origen chose to write down, and thankfully Origen was pretty thorough. So in essence, we don't need to search for a lost text. We need to understand what we already have. And I'm fairly certain that we have about 80%-ish of Celsus's treatise. And so if we understand that 80%, it might not all flow very nicely when you just print Celsus's material, but there are some real purple passages and gems there which are absolutely priceless. And this is why I really recommend everybody familiarize yourself with this literature, because a lot of what people do, including modern atheists, is they really try to reinvent the wheel. And there are places where I've noticed that actually they argue more poorly and in less informed way than Celsus back in the 2nd century. And if they could go that far back, they could, in a sense, be much more nuanced, or at least come to a greater understanding. And that's really the goal of this game. We want to really fully understand what's going on, and one of our best access points is to go to the very first full-scale critic himself.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, he really does sound like a prototype of like what comes later with like Nietzsche or uh um Dawkins, or like where people are like, why is your God the only one that we should care about when there's all these other gods? Or you see the same type of arguments being passed down. And I thought about this when you mentioned how you said he was familiar with Matthew, and you talked about the logos in there. Does he give his opinion on what he thinks about the logos in the sense of Christianity? Does he ever mention that at all, or no?
Absolutely, yeah. So he does have a passage on that, and he warms up to that, because what the logos is it's sort of like a Platonic way of expressing um, Christian doctrine. And so, yes, he's well aware of that move, and he does engage with that. But in the end, for instance, the prologue of John for a Platonist sounds very unsophisticated in the end, and very wrong-headed, because the logos, as a being of pure mind and light, would never degrade itself to taking on flesh
Right.
or being born from a woman. And that's not because Celsus hates the flesh. It's just that, according to Platonists, a god would only, well, first of all, God can't change. But if you had a lower god who could change, such as the Logos, it would only change for the better, wouldn't degrade.
Wow.
And by incarnating itself, going through the womb of a woman, that is a degradation. It would be sort of like, to use the analogy of, it would be sort of like if we had the technology so that, I could download my consciousness into a worm. Would I do that? Should I do that? The Platonists would say, no, you probably should not do that. That would not be fun. Now, that's not because, the Platonist hates worms. It's just because they view worms as a lower non-rational life form. So if you were to download yourself, or to somehow incarnate yourself into a worm, you would not be living out your full potential, and you would not be flourishing as a rational being. And so the same way with a divine being, a divine being who becomes flesh and blood, subject to disease and death, is not doing what a god should do, or what any god would do. So that's his logic.
Yeah. And that's interesting. It's like you're beating theology with theology. Like you're playing the game. You're in the same arena. You're not an outsider. Like it's almost like it's a fair way to try to beat an argument, is actually to go down and play at that level, if that makes sense. Instead of being like, oh, that's all silly. You guys are, no one, like, Christians aren't listening to that. But a Christian might be more susceptible to listen to another theology argument from a Platonist, for example, from whatever. So I think that's fascinating. I definitely want to look into that more. And the last thing I want to ask you is about the Pantera thing. This is a hot topic. People love talking about this. If you do a video on Pantera, it gets tons of views. So where do you think he gets this from? Do you think because I got from James Tabor that he got this from the Jews, or so somewhere in his sources he says he gets it from the Jews or something, or do you think he's the first one to make this up? What do you think?
Well, I think the clincher is that Celsus doesn't represent himself as giving this argument. He represents a Jew as giving this argument. And it's recently been argued by Mara and Niehoff that Celsus actually had a Jewish source, which he then represented. I think the jury is still very much out there, but in the sense that the argument is not that he didn't have a Jewish source. I think he had a Jewish source. It was probably from Palestine, if we could guess. And but the question is, did he have like this lengthy written text, which he then copied out into his treatise? Well, I don't know. I would probably say not. But I don't think there's any real dispute that Celsus knew Jewish traditions and he could represent Jewish arguments.
Yeah.
And so definitely, yeah, the Pantera argument is probably coming from Jews of Palestinian heritage. And that's where it shows up later, because it shows up in Jewish literature later there.
Right.
In rabbinic literature.
Yeah, and the Tosefta. And but what's so fascinating about this is, for me, this is a really strong case against mythicism, because if this guy didn't exist, there would be you would think there would be some people from Palestine arguing, I never heard of this guy, I don't know his family, no one has any history of this guy, no, he just came out of nowhere. But instead you have people saying, yeah, he was there, his father was probably a Roman soldier. They're not arguing that he didn't exist, they're just giving other examples of other explanations of who he is and why he's not that special, or he's there, yeah, he's real, yeah, we hung him on Passover Eve, whatever. Like, it's not, you're not hearing he didn't exist ever. So I think that alone is a big deal. You should pay. I think that's a strong case against mythicism.
Well, it certainly shows that mythicism is an entirely modern phenomenon that is born out of this modern consciousness of the great, what Lessing called, the great ditch of history. It's just so long ago now that it's as far as, Greek gods are, so the life of Jesus seems just as distant as the life of Heracles. But for the Greeks themselves, and Celsus himself says this, he says, this guy was here just recently. And the fact that he's so recent is part of the problem, and that he was just here yesterday, basically. So from their perspective, they never even fathomed the idea that he could be a complete fiction. I mean, it's not even on their radar, because
right.
They don't doubt that he existed, and that's all that would be a very weird way of arguing for all of these people, because his cultural memory is still with people. And Celsus himself, as he's wandering around the marketplace, finds a whole bunch of other people who he thinks basically are like Jesus, like prophets.
Right.
So he doesn't doubt that there was a prophet like Jesus, because he sees them all the time.
Yeah. It seems like my friend Justin Sledge just did a video on other Jewish first century healers, and like Hanina Ben-Dosa, guys like that who have similar stories. They're doing miracles, and they were going against the grain and anti-government or whatever. It's the story. It's the story that you hear all the time in this time in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's because we're unfamiliar with the historical context that it just seems like a mythical world to us. But
right.
No, for them it was raw and real and of recent memory. Yep.
And that's all I got. And make sure you go and check out the Patreon of M.Div Litwa. The link is in the description, and it is worth every penny. And you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.